What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about the new Warzone Nephilim expansion for Warhammer 40k, because today, on June 14th, 2022, we did get a big preview of Warzone Nephilim mechanics that is going to go a long way to confirming a lot of the rumors that we've heard about the mechanics in this new edition of the 40k chapter-approved rule set. Now, for those who don't know, these chapter-approved rule sets give competitive rules to Warhammer 40,000. Particularly, they include the Grand Tournament book, which has all of the missions and secondary objectives that are going to be used for that particular season of competitive play. They've been releasing in 6-month periods, and this heralds a move from the previous season of Warzone Nachmund to the new edition of Warzone Nephilim. And there are some enormous transformative changes that have been previewed and that are being confirmed by this article in this new edition of the match play rules. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Now, to be fair, these are only rules if you are playing GT games of Warhammer 40k. So generally speaking, if you're playing a lot of organized play or in tournaments, you will be using these rules, but not every game or format is going to use these. So depending on the format that you're playing in, you're not necessarily going to be using these particular mechanics. Now, the first big change that was spoiled a while ago and that we've talked about a little bit is that the command point total for Incursion and Strike Force games in this new packet is changing. Previously, you started with 12 CP and then gained 1 at the start of each battle round for essentially a total of 17 to spend over the course of the game, plus 1 per battle round regenerations if you had any sort of CP regeneration mechanics. That is being overhauled entirely. Now you start with half that amount, meaning that Strike Force games will start with 6 command points, and you will gain 1 each turn rather than at the start of each battle round, meaning that over the course of each battle round, you're going to be getting a total of 2 CP for a grand total of an additional 10 CP over the course of the game. So this means that all told, you're going to have 1 less total command point to spend over the entirety of the game, because you will have 6 to start with, 10 over the game for 16 rather than 12 to start with, and 5 over the game for 17. Now, in addition, this means that your command points are dispersed at a steadier, more constant rate over the course of the game, rather than you being able to overload your first couple of turns with a ton of stratagem use. This means that you may actually get less use out of your CP in general, meaning that individual command points are going to be becoming dramatically more valuable. Now, we've talked about this a little bit on a recent live stream, and I actually think this change is going to be pretty interesting, because one thing that it will do is keep gameplay very interesting throughout the entirety of the game, rather than just for the first 2 or 3 turns. One thing that often happens in current games of the Nachmund GT season is that past rounds 2 or maybe 3, players have largely expended all of their command points and are just saving up for particular stratagems or kind of working with the dregs that they're getting at the start of each battle round. This means that a lot of very interesting reactive stratagems don't get used because there's simply not enough command points to use them. But now, getting 2 command points per battle round means that you might have more of an opportunity to use things like interrupts and defensive stratagems throughout the entirety of the game, not just at the beginning. Now, obviously, the impact of those stratagems is typically going to be a little bit higher at the beginning of the game when there are more models on the table, but it keeps the gameplay fresh throughout the entire game, and I think makes the emphasis on the late game a little bit higher. Now, the other change that we see here is one that was rumored, and we did not know if it would change, and a lot of people are a little bit worried about, and that is this change to Relics and Warlord traits. Now, another thing that's going to make command points even more valuable, in this new season of Grand Tournament, you no longer get a free Relic and Warlord trait when you construct your army. So previously, you would select your Warlord. The Warlord, if they were a character, would automatically unlock themselves a Warlord trait. Then they would unlock a Relic from your codex for any of the units in their same sub-faction. That's been changed. Now, neither of those unlock, and you have to spend command points to do it. All factions now have access to this generic Warlord trait and Relic requisition stratagem, and then on top of that, you can use the other faction-specific stratagems, if you have them, to unlock additional Relics and Warlord traits. I know a lot of people were worried about this rumor when it came out that older factions that maybe don't have requisition stratagems in their codex yet would not be able to get access to Relics and Warlord traits, and I think that fear was totally unjustified. It would have been pretty silly if stratagems like this weren't included in the Nephilim book, but they are, so don't worry, if you're playing Astra Militarum or Chaos Demons or something like that, you will still have access to your Relics and Warlord traits, just at the cost of 1 CP. Now, I do think that this is probably a healthy change for the game, although it's one that I don't like. I really enjoy the aspect of Hero Hammer and customizing, individual characters, but this makes it much more costly to do so. And as we said, essentially command points are going to be increasing in value, meaning spending command points on Relics or Warlord traits that you mostly have, for flavor or because you like them, is going to be a little bit more pricey and something that you may leave at home. Meaning that I think ultimately it boils the game down to a select number of character builds that each faction takes, rather than giving players more flexibility. I'd rather see people take more Relics and Warlord traits than less, but I understand that this is an important balance point, because especially a lot of the most powerful codexes currently have a ton of exceedingly powerful Relic and Warlord trait combinations for their characters. And one of the things that a lot of factions like Tau, Tyranids, or Eldari can hang their game plan on are these impressive character builds that can do massive damage while being relatively safe. Things like Tau Commanders, you have Warlord traits like Precision of the Hunter to give full rerolls, you have the Bow of Kurnos and Mark of the Incomparable Hunter combo in Eldari, and even just a Hive Tyrant with Reaper of Obliterax in Tyranids. All of those are incredibly powerful combat characters that do massive damage that most other factions don't have access to. So forcing an additional command point expenditure on those factions does go a little bit of a way to balance armies that have these overpowered styles of characters. Whereas if you're an army that does not have good selections for Relics and Warlord traits, you actually sort of get to save command points because you don't have to be spending command points on those. I think a lot of the optimized factions are basically going to be playing with slightly more CP because they simply won't be taking Relics and Warlord traits that never had a particularly strong effect on the game. Interestingly, I think this also takes a little bit of focus away from the Warlord selection. So if we're analyzing each individual Relic or Warlord trait as a 1 CP expenditure, and you have a character that is required to be your army's Warlord, you can actually probably just skip the classic Warlord trait upgrade on them and move to other characters that you might want a more flexible Warlord trait with. So this opens up detachments like Supreme Command detachments with Supreme Commanders like Shadow Sun a little bit more freely, since even though that model has to be your army's Warlord, you could just skip spending the CP for a Warlord trait on them and use that CP to buy Warlord traits elsewhere with your Codex requisition stratagems. Now, the other big change that we're going to be seeing in this new updated GT pack is updates to faction-specific secondary objectives, and I am super psyched for these. Every single faction-specific secondary in the game is going to be included in the GT booklet rather than each individual codex, so the codex faction secondaries will no longer be used, and they've all been rebalanced, and we can see a couple of examples here. I think most interestingly, too, we even have multiple options of faction-specific secondaries for factions that do not have a 9th edition codex yet. So we can see Astra Militarum getting an entire gamut of faction secondaries rather than just the single secondary that they got in the GT Nachmund book. And these secondaries are actually pretty badass. We'll talk about Adeptus Mechanicus real quick, because we can make out here some changes to the Adeptus Mechanicus faction secondaries. Essentially, a lot of these have required that Adeptus Mechanicus units be involved in the scoring of the secondary somehow. I don't know if this means that unlocking faction-specific secondaries is going to be a little bit more open than it is in the current version of the GT pack, or whether or not they're just trying to hedge their bets from things like Agents of the Imperium, like individual knights or assassins or things like that. I'm not 100% sure, but there are some new restrictions there that essentially you have to destroy units with Adeptus Mechanicus models or hold objectives with Adeptus Mechanicus models to score the Adeptus Mechanicus specific secondary objectives. We do see a little bit of changes to Eradication of the Flesh, for example, which has been reworked slightly to essentially be a grind them down specifically for Adeptus Mechanicus vehicles. That's sort of how it worked in the past, but now it only covers units destroyed by your own Adeptus Mechanicus vehicles, meaning that you have to have killed more units with vehicles than you lost of vehicles. It's no longer a grind them down equivalent that requires your vehicles to still be alive. Now the vehicles actually have to be doing the work themselves. Uncharted Sequencing got that clause to require that the objectives that you pick with it are held by Adeptus Mechanicus units, and the same is true for Hidden Archaea Vault. The Archaea Vault also changed to, instead of being a modal scoring, where you score 2 victory points at the end of each battle round if you control the chosen objective and 5 at the end of the game, now it just scores 4 points at the end of the battle round if you control the Archaea Vault objective marker. Now let's talk about Astra Militarum, because Astra Militarum got an entire swath of new secondary objectives, and some of them seem pretty good. The first one is by Lasgun and Bayonet, which is a little bit of an evolution of their existing secondary objective. This one gives you 1 VP each time an enemy unit that was within range of an objective marker at the start of that turn is destroyed by an Astra Militarum unit from your army. This is interesting because there's no cap to the number of points you can score on it over the course of a single turn or battle round, meaning that if your opponent has a lot of individual units on an objective and you're able to wipe them all off, you can potentially be scoring 3, 4, or 5 points a turn on this secondary. You can also potentially score it on your opponent's turn. If you kill enemies in Overwatch or in Melee that started the turn in range of an objective marker, even if they moved away from that objective marker to do something else. The Shadow Operations Secondary Special Orders is a relatively standard objective marker cleansing style of action secondary, where Militarum infantry units within 12 inches of officers can perform the action on an objective marker that they control that is not within their deployment zone. Interestingly, this is control, not necessarily clear of enemies, meaning that even if enemies are contesting the objective, as long as they haven't taken control of it, which is oftentimes pretty hard with the number of objective secured models Astra Militarum can bring and pile onto objectives, you'll still be able to start to perform the action. The action is completed at the end of your turn and will get you victory points equal to the number of expunged objective markers that you have performed the action on over the course of the game, potentially maxing out at 15. This is a little bit tough, though, because it does have to be performed on objective markers not within your deployment zone, meaning that oftentimes there are only 4 objective markers on the table that are eligible to be expunged by your army. I think the average number of objective markers cleared with this secondary is going to be 2. You could get 3 on a good day, and you're basically tabling your opponent if you get 4, meaning that I doubt that this is going to be better than a lot of the other Shadow Operations secondaries that are going to be present in the book. That said, the Battlefield Supremacy secondary is really powerful, this being Boots on the Ground, which gives you a little bit of a different engage in all fronts style of secondary. You score a victory point for each table quarter that has a regiment infantry unit wholly within it, not including characters, and that unit is not within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. In addition, you score another victory point if 1 or more units from your army that is equipped with a regimental standard is wholly within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield or within your opponent's deployment zone. This is a super cool secondary. It unfortunately can't be scored on the first turn, which is the one huge downside. Otherwise, the first clause of the secondary would net you an easy 10 points over the course of the game, probably scoring you your 2 home table quarters with infantry units, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th turns for 2 points apiece. In addition, if you have any units that are pushing forward, and especially with mobility effects like move, 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 that's pretty easy for an Astra Militarum army to do, you can be getting 3 or 4 points on that first clause every turn. If you have an infantry-focused army that's relatively aggressive and is pushing across the table to contest enemy objectives, you're going to be getting 2 or 3 victory points a turn on this secondary super easily. I like the second clause that gives you an additional incentive to take regimental standards. I think secondaries like this are super fluffy and super interesting, and maybe give you another incentive to take some specific units or specific war gears in order to net a couple extra points from them. But this secondary seems like an easy 10, potentially even an easy 12 points over the course of the game, and is potentially maxable at 15 very easily as well. I think this is a really good choice if the other Battlefield Supremacy secondaries aren't particularly good in the mission that you're playing. And one thing that we do know about this season of Grand Tournament is that the Stranglehold Secondary is being removed, meaning that Battlefield Supremacy slot is going to be much wider open, and I think that having this secondary in the bank is going to be a pretty good one. Now, one thing that's really interesting about this secondary is the fact that it requires bracketed regiment infantry, not simply Astra Militarum infantry. That is specifically so that you cannot score this secondary with Tempestus Scions, and that was immediately where my mind went to, because being able to deep strike Tempestus Scions in the back edge of your opponent's deployment zone to easily score additional table quarters for that first clause, while on top of that being able to potentially perform your Shadow Operations secondaries, would be super duper powerful. But unfortunately, it does require regiment infantry units, which are your standard Astra Militarum units. Now, I do think that there are probably going to be some builds that are going to be able to take advantage of this secondary. Anything that makes heavy use of outflankers or strategic reservers are going to be pretty good at scoring this pretty highly. So So I think this is definitely the standout for me of secondaries in this Astra Militarum section so far. But that's not the last one, because we do have a No Mercy, No Respite secondary, Inflexible Command. This scores you victory points at the end of your turn if your Militarum units are syncing up with your officers. This means that you'll get 2 victory points at the end of your turn if all of your infantry units are within 6 inches of an officer unit. However, there is a clause at the bottom of the secondary that specifies that infantry units that are equipped with a Voxcaster satisfy this requirement if they are within 24 inches of an officer. In addition, you get an additional victory point if all of your vehicles are within 12 inches of a friendly vehicle officer, and you get a victory point if any enemy units were destroyed by Astra Militarum units being affected by orders, either standard regimental orders or tank orders. Now, this one's pretty interesting to me. I do think it requires you to play a little bit more clumped up than most Astra Militarum armies would want. Although the fact that now infantry squad unit upgrades are free, meaning you can take Voxcasters much more readily in your infantry squad, meaning that they oftentimes count as being in range for the secondary almost anywhere they are on the table, does make it a lot better. And scoring potentially 3 victory points per round by either killing an enemy unit, having all your guys within 6 inches of officers, or instead of killing units, just having your vehicles next to your tank commanders, does mean that you do maxes at the end of the game. Interestingly, it also becomes much easier to score as the game goes on and as your squishy infantry units start to get killed. Now, the one downside I think about this is that oftentimes Astra Militarum infantry units are pushing pretty aggressively up the table to contest enemy objectives, or, like we just talked about with the previous secondary, deep striking or strategic reserving in your opponent's backline in order to backstab them or complete other secondary objectives. And that is a potential failure mode for the secondary, because I think you want to be scoring at the very least those 2 victory points around for having all of your infantry units in the right place in order to justify taking the secondary. Now, fortunately, one other change in this book is that you can now take multiple secondaries from your faction-specific secondary trees, meaning that you no longer need to choose between taking the Inflexible Command or the Boots on the Ground. If you have an army that is constructed appropriately for those, you could potentially be taking all 3, Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and Lasgun and Bayonet, in a single game, meaning that you can really play into your army's strengths rather than having to pick and choose which of your good faction-specific secondaries you want to be taking advantage of. Now, in addition, there is a little note at the bottom of the page here, which is specifying that Super Heavy Auxiliary detachments now cost no CP if they match your Warlord's sub-faction. Previously, it gave you a CP refund, 2 CP off of a 3 CP cost, meaning that Super Heavy Auxiliary would still cost you 1 command point, but now it looks like that's going down to 0, meaning that hopefully those Super Heavy Auxiliaries are going to be a little bit more palatable with the reworked valuation of individual command points. We also got a little bit of a reminder of the free points update that we have talked about previously on this channel. Now, all of the Munitorum Field Manual points are going to be released for free on the Warhammer app and as a PDF on the Warhammer community website, rather than being released as a booklet that was super obnoxious to play with. As I've talked about before, I think this is awesome, finally bringing 40k into the 21st century, super exciting, and I hope that they take this as an opportunity to change the points values of units in the game with a little bit more agility, rather than sitting on them for 6 months at a time and watching factions slowly asphyxiate to death in an overpowered metagame that they can't really compete in. But anyway, that's everything I wanted to talk about in this Warhammer community article. It looks like we are about 2 weeks away from the release of Warzone Nephilim, which I believe is slated for release on the 25th of June, so end of this month. I couldn't be more excited for it because I think that the changes to the game are going to be transformative and really shake things up. And I don't know about you all, but I've been feeling a little bit sad about the current state of 40k. Although things are looking up right now because we are seeing a little bit of a shakeup in the metagame, it has been kind of a tale of the newly released codexes being more and more powerful and other factions having a tough time fighting with them. But hopefully with these changes to how the game plays, in addition to a big points rebalance that can see the top echelon of the metagame knocked down and maybe some buffs to the bottom level factions, we can see a wholly new game moving into July and the remainder of the season. I'm super excited for it, and I hope you are too, and as always, we'll be talking about it here on the channel, so drop a like and a subscribe and all that stuff. Big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all those people are awesome. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.